What's up, guys? So this is going to be the post-Photon Hypernova tier list. Now, it's obvious what decks are going to be the best. I think there's really no question about that. But Konami have buffed a lot of other decks. So, yeah, it's definitely going to be interesting to see a few decks that are going to have a bit of potential, even if they're not going to be the best decks. But let's start off. So, Pendulums. Pendulum's somewhere mid to low rogue. It's not a bad deck at all, especially with the new Draco Slayer cards. I'd say the biggest issue obviously is always going to be that because you need two cards to basically start playing the game, you just end up with a minus compared to your opponent, and that's what holds Draco Slayers back. Now, last format, with it mainly being a graveyard focused format, they could at least just shove Necro Valleys and stuff in and then be okay. Next format, unfortunately, Casteria is so good that it's not enough to just be able to hate the graveyard, because Casteria are going to banish your cards instead, and so because of that I think they're going to be a lot weaker. Sky Striker similarly, they receive loads and loads of support, but I just don't think it's good enough. Mystic Mind is not in the game anymore, so those kind of burn and stall strategies are not going to be relevant. Now, Sprite is going to be, I think, our first tier 1 deck, and I think it's going to be the weakest of the three. There are a lot of different Sprite variants, but I think the nice thing about Sprite, even though its power level isn't as high as Casteria, I keep saying that, Castera or Tier, the advantage Sprite has is utility. They can play so many tech cards and they can focus on destroying things, and they're not hurt as hard by Shifter. They're not really hurt by Necro Valley. They're not really hurt by Ishizu cards. They can play around a lot of these things and play a lot of these cards. They also have really good options to kind of OTK through the new Ninja Shadow Mosquito. We've got the Gishki cards. I mean, just a lot of potential with Sprite. So I definitely think it's going to be a tier 1 deck just because it's got that utility. And if you're the kind of player who you're very technical, you're good at making certain lists and all these kind of things, I think Sprite is really the one for you. It's going to be a really good option. Then next, Dragonlink. Dragonlink, I'm going to say, is going to be somewhere low tier 2 mid rogue. What tends to happen with that deck, in my opinion, is it starts off quite weak, and then through the format as it gets solved, it tends to move up a little bit. So low tier 2 mid rogue, nothing too special to say about it, but it's going to be good. Now, Runic, in terms of power level, I'm going to say is mid to tier 2, but I'm definitely going to put it as one to watch. I think this is a really, really good format for Runic. Runic plays really well into Castera, because even though they don't like their cards being banished and stuff, they don't get hurt by a lot of the stuff Castera is trying to do, which is good. And they can also play a lot of floodgates and things like that. Castera, their board is easy to break, and they don't play well into most floodgates, because even they can out it with cards like Fenrir, the deck, for example, if you put a card in their board like Silent Wobby, which Runic can easily play, they get really, really hard punished for it. None of their monsters really have good protection. I think it's Shangri-La that protects itself from being destroyed, and that's it. They don't have target protection. And all of that is just combined to mean that Runic is definitely one to watch. So I'm going to say it's going to be mid to low tier 2, but definitely a good kind of off-meta option for you guys to play and try and destroy those top decks. Then next we have Sun Avalon. Sun Avalon's going to be mid to low rogue, somewhere mid to low rogue, probably better than those two, but yeah, it's just, again, too much hate for decks like this in the format, which is going to be a problem. Sword Soul, I'm actually going to say is going to be mid tier 2. Sword Soul has the advantage. Now look, if you're a deck this format, if you're a deck that can normally play Pot of Desires, that means that you're probably not too hurt by Castera, because it's a similar concept. Castera is likely going to banish targeted amounts of cards from your extra deck or random cards from your main deck. And so decks that can play Desires like Sword Soul won't be hurt as hard by Casteria, and then can just destroy their board and OTK them, or destroy their board and set up a board. Sword Soul's also not bad against tier. They've got a lot of good ways to combat the tier stuff. Now, they don't like Bestow cards amazingly because it does hurt the Tenyi side, and they don't like Ishizu cards amazingly because that also hurts the Tenyi side, but I still think Sword Soul has a lot of potential. So definitely a good option tier 2, and the best thing is it's really cheap. You can pick up the whole core for about £30-40, including the extra deck, because everything's been reprinted and everything's so cheap. So definitely one to watch. Virtual World, unfortunately, is going to be really low rogue. It's just not consistent enough. That's fundamentally the issue. Virtual World, if it was more consistent, I would actually say it would be a high tier 2 deck, because it's got all the tools to deal with everything. Even the ability to bring back face down banish cards with Nian Nian as part of your combo is insane. But unfortunately, it's just not consistent enough, and that's always going to hold it back. So unless someone can somehow crack this deck to make it more consistent somehow, Virtual World unfortunately is going to be low rogue. Labyrinth is definitely going to be a mid to high tier 2 deck. Now, the issue of Labyrinth last format, and this is the problem I've always had with it, is that it's a trap deck that needs to use monsters, and that removes a lot of the strengths of a trap deck. Now, what makes Labyrinth good though is the fact that it's a trap deck with redundancy. and I'm using a lot of random words. What I mean when I say redundancy is, if you, unlike Eldritch, if you lose your Golden Lords, you basically lose the game. In Labyrinth, none of your monsters really matter if you lose them. They have their field spell, which has utility. They have the big monsters. They have loads of traps. They can play so many different cards, and getting these cards banished doesn't hurt them. Banished face down doesn't hurt them hugely. And so because of that, I think Labyrinth is a lot better than the other decks. And then being a back row deck, it just gives it an inherent advantage a lot of the time in game one, because your opponent won't be prepared to deal with that much back row. So I do think Labyrinth is a good option, and also they're getting some great support. Big welcome. Labyrinth is an incredible card. I mean, yeah, Labyrinth is definitely one to watch. Madolche, I'm actually also going to say, is a high rogue, low tier 2. The nice thing about Madolche is that even though, again, it doesn't like a lot of the stuff that Kashtira does, and this is going to be the story for a lot of decks, Kashtira really is going to change deck building because of how oppressive it can be and the effect that it can effectively permanently remove cards. But Madolche does have a lot of redundancy in the extra deck, and it's one of those decks similar to Salamangreat and a lot of Cyberse decks where all of its plays are really in the extra deck. The main deck is just a vehicle to get to the extra deck. And because of that, I think it gives it an advantage. It means that it is going to be able to compete, even if it loses half of its main deck, it can still play through the extra deck, which is quite nice. And then also it can play a lot of tech cards. It can play the Ishizu cards. So yeah, Madolche definitely one to watch. I would say is going to be high rogue, low tier 2. We definitely will see at least 1 or 2 Madolche top. Drytron, I'm sorry, it's actually non-meta. I mean, it just keeps getting worse and worse for Drytron. There's just so much graveyard here. Hey, and this is one of the strongest, like, highest ceiling graveyard decks in that it can make an almost uncrackable board, but it doesn't matter because it's so easy to disrupt it right now. I don't see that changing anytime soon. Dinos is an okay deck, however it's a consistency issue. Not having enough Miscellaneousaurus, I don't know, one of you guys can tell me how to say that. Not having enough of that card just hurts it too much in my opinion. Consistency is the name of the game as well, because all of the top decks are comboing off of one card and they have like 4 or 5 different starters in the deck. So if your deck doesn't have consistent 1-card starters, it's not going to work, and Dinos doesn't have that many consistent 1-card starters. Gren Marju is not bad, and I'm going to actually say it's one to watch again. I've said this before, but board breakers are actually quite good again in the format because Kashtira loses hard to them. Even though Tyr and Sprite don't lose hard to board breakers, there are good board breakers that can deal with those cards, and because of that, I think Gren Marju is going to be that deck that can kind of sneak in a win here or there. Now, I thought it was going to happen last format, it didn't, but I definitely think at least this format, Gren Marju does have a little bit of potential. Tri Brigade, I'm going to put as mid to high rogue. The thing about Tri Brigade that's interesting is that while it's a strong deck, the issues with Tri Brigade a lot of the times really fundamentally come down to the fact that they're kind of reliant on their kind of initial Tri Brigade banish or whatever going through. If that goes through, they have such an incredible resource game, but if it doesn't get through, they get stunned. And then also just Revolt Appaloosa Pass is not an amazing board anymore, but they do have some extra plays they can do. Some of the new branded cards actually do help Tri Brigade, so there is a bit of synergy there as well. And all of that combined mean that I do think Tri Brigade has a bit of potential. There's also Tri Brigade Sprite variants, but we don't see them much because really there's better Sprite variants to play. But all of that being said, I do think Tri Brigade has a little bit of potential. High rogue, I would say, better than most of the other rogue decks. We might see it pop into tier 2, but it's really hard to say. Flunderies. So Flunderies is going to be the next tier 1 deck. And actually I'll put it at the top of tier 2, but it's a tier 1 deck. Yeah, so I'll put it in tier 1. And the reason why I'll say that is because the thing about Flunderies is that it can just ignore a lot of the things, a lot of the interruptions, a lot of the interactions, a lot of the disruptions that every other deck puts in. And because of that, it just makes it so unfair and difficult to play against. Now, and the other thing as well about Flunderies, and I played this recently in a tournament, is that it's quite straightforward to execute on. It's hard to misplay on. And I think that gives an advantage to most players because just the fact that basically you normal summon Rabina, if they don't have an interaction, you pretty much get your full board, which plays itself, and you get all the recursion, is hugely beneficial, especially in a longer tournament. So yeah, Flunderies is definitely going to be a high tier 2, low tier 1 deck. I think the disadvantage of Flunderies, which it's always going to have, or the two disadvantages, is firstly, some of the cards are kind of useless, and so it makes it a bit bricky. So it's like some of your little birds aren't amazing, some of your spells and traps need other cards to work. And then also Flunderies has the issue of that leads on to the first issue, which is that it's a bit bricky. Sometimes you're just going to lose to your own deck, and that's always going to hurt in a longer tournament. But if Flunderies does pop off with no interruption, it does win a lot of matchups. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't auto-win by banishing stuff like it did last format, but it is still going to dominate enough matchups that I do think Flunderies is a really good pick. I would say that Sprite and Flunderies are the two weaker tier 1 decks this format. I think there's two very high tier 1 decks and two very low tier 1 decks. I don't think it's going to be a tier 0 format anymore though, but we'll see if Tier Element stays as tier 0. Moving on, Eldritch is non-meta, just, yeah, too much graveyard hate. It's just not good enough. The Synchro Dragon builds are also just not good enough at the moment. They're not doing anything special without Hulk. Exosister, I'm actually going to move down into mid rogue, and the problem with Exosister, which really just keeps coming about, is that it just doesn't actually do enough. Martha is a good card, but unless Exosister is against tier element, it's just a bit too specific in how it counters graveyard to be relevant. And a lot of the times, I see Exosister players winning because they open Shifter and Martha, for example. They open Shifter and then they can OTK next turn, which a lot of other decks can do. So I just don't think it's that good. Again, it has a great tier element matchup, and if tier element does stay tier 0, which it might, there is a good chance. I don't think so, but there is a good chance it will stay tier 0. Then Exosister will be great. But yeah, it hasn't been performing in the TCG, and I'm not surprised. It's just not doing a great job. It's too specific. Salamangreat is actually another one I'm going to put as one to watch. And I'll tell you, again, this format, there's a lot of things that you're going to want. But if you're a deck that essentially doesn't have to rely on lights and darks in the graveyard, doesn't have to rely on or doesn't lose hard to getting cards banished from your main deck, so you have a lot of redundancy in your main deck, and if you're a deck that can play hand traps, I think you have huge potential. And Salamangreat has all of that. And Marintis is the same thing, but worse than Salamangreat, which is why I'm going to put in Rogue instead of putting one to watch. But I do think Salamangreat is one to watch because of that, because just the fact that it can play hand traps, most of these hand traps which can be good against Kashtira does lose quite hard to hand traps. And then also, it's not lights and darks in the graveyard, so it doesn't lose to Bestials. Now, obviously, it doesn't like the Ishizu cards, but it can play around them, because with Salamangreat, on your opponent's turn, you're not trying to do too much in the graveyard. It's actually on your turn that you're trying to do a lot in the graveyard. And so a lot of the times it's not going to matter that they have Ishizu cards, because you would have hand trapped them out, or they wouldn't have got them into the graveyard, etc, etc, etc. It can also play Dweller to deal with Tia. I do think Salamangreat has potential. In terms of power level, it's going to be high Rogue, but yeah, definitely one to watch, and definitely one that I would say that if you're a Salamangreat fan, it might be a good deck to look at. Unfortunately, I'm going to say that Mathmech is going to be mid to low Rogue. Again, it's just that it's a light deck. It's a good deck. It's a strong deck. It's Mathmech, Salamangreat, and Marintis are all three basically the same Cyberse decks, just different attributes. But Mathmech, unfortunately, has the disadvantage of being a light and dark deck, and that does hold it back. Punk is going to be low Rogue. Yeah, combo decks just don't work this format. If you have one-offs in your main deck, and you're not like completely FTKing your opponent turn 1, you're just going to lose to Kashtira, unfortunately. It's just not enough, and they're also graveyard reliant as well, so just, yeah, Punk is not good. DDD is non-meta. Yeah, again, it's just a dark deck, so it loses to Bestials, it loses to Ishizu, it loses to Kashtira. It's not as strong as Terelement. Just not good enough, unfortunately. Now, Terelement is going to be, in my opinion, likely to be the strongest deck this format, as it has been last format. I think it is a little bit weaker because we have more tools to counter it with the Kashtira cards and etc. But I still do think it will be the strongest deck of the format by a margin. I'm expecting to see kind of 40 to 60% representation of tier elements. So I'm not sure if it'll be tier 0, but definitely the strongest tier 1 deck. Yeah, and there's loads of different ways you can play it as well, which is another thing as well. Then moving on from that, we're going to have Ignista. Now, unfortunately, even though Ignista is a non-light and dark, yeah, it's got lights and darks, but it's not mainly lights and darks. The main disadvantage with Ignista is the one-offs. It's got too many one-offs that it has to play, and so it loses hard to Kashtira because of that. And then also, just Arrival just doesn't auto-win anymore. It used to win, but there are now more and more cards. Every set, I think for the last 3 sets, they've released a different way that Arrival can be outed. And so because of that, it's just not good enough in my opinion. ABC is not a meta deck. It's not relevant. Autoclass is not a meta deck. It's not relevant. Albaz is definitely one to watch, and I think in terms of power level, it will be high tier 2. They've got so much support, and the thing that really helps this deck now is that they've lost 2 of their biggest weaknesses, which is 1, they're not super reliant on branded fusion anymore. They have a lot of ways to play. Blazing Cartesia is a second starter for the deck, which is actually incredible. The deck didn't have a second starter before, but now Blazing Cartesia can actually set up multi-interaction boards, which is really, really good. And also, if you have hands like Aluba plus Cartesia, you can now use Cartesia to dodge stuff on your Aluba, hand traps on your Aluba, which is really good. So it's not super reliant on branded fusion, And also, it's not super reliant on monsters in the graveyard. It now has that branded. It has actual negation, so it has that branded. I don't know what the card's called, but it negates all face-up cards, which is really really good. It has the new fusion Lindworm, which is actually a negate on the board. Having that kind of ability in branded is huge, and it's not. It's something branded was really really missing. But I think because of that, branded is definitely going to be a strong deck to look at next format. Definitely going to be high tier one. And another great thing about branded is that now it has redundancy. One of the things about before is that you had to play a lot of random one-ups. You don't have to play as many one-ups. You can play 2 or 3 of almost most of your best extra deck monsters and get away with it in branded, which is also really really good. Doesn't lose to shifter, doesn't lose to dweller. I mean, really really good deck. Definitely one to watch out for. Vaynerself didn't do anything. I thought it might have a chance. There are some funny things this deck can do, but just ultimately speaking, it's just not really good enough, so not relevant. Now, I don't know why I've got... Oh, that is a Naturia monster. I was wondering why I've got that there, but yeah. Naturia Runic is definitely going to be a mid-tier 2 deck. This deck is good just because it does a lot of unfair things. The Runic cards are fundamentally unfair. Naturia Beast is fundamentally unfair. However, Naturia will always have the weakness of the fact that its monsters are kind of tiny and rubbish, and that does hold it back a little bit. But it is still good because it can obviously play some unfair cards and it can just kind of grind and frustrate your opponent out. Don't think it's going to be amazing, but definitely an okay option. Now, White Zoa of Dogmatica. So this is specifically that ritual in Dogmatica, and I actually think it's quite good. I think, again... It doesn't do enough yet, or I haven't seen a solved build, but I think one of the nice things about this card is that it's basically a 1-card combo now for Dogmatrix. And it means that it can, this deck, I've played it blind second because, funnily enough, the Dogmatic engine is really, really good at playing blind second. It also doesn't lose super hard, obviously, to Kashtira, because it doesn't really care about the extra deck. It doesn't really care about a lot of the cards in the main deck. It's so easy to summon out White Zoa, and completely shutting down your opponent's extra deck is huge. Now, the problem is this format, if you look at most decks, basically, you have the decks that are really strong, like Tia, Sprite, and Flunder, which they're either so strong that it doesn't matter if you get rid of 6 of the extra deck cards because they'll probably win anyway, or they don't care about the extra deck, like Flunder, and then you have everything else, which is going to be geared to countering those. And so because of that, there's not a lot of those combo decks, because Kashtira is already countering them. That means that White Zoa isn't as good as it could be, for example, because if it were in a format with a lot of combo decks that had one-offs in the extra deck, you could just do a going first White Zoa build, mess up their extra deck, have a couple of hand traps, and you'd probably win. That's not good enough this format, but it's definitely one to watch in the future. I do think if things like Kashtira cards get banned, and if some tier cards get banned, White Zoa Dogmatica will definitely be a deck to watch out for and definitely have some potential. So yeah, one to watch out for. Now, the Ishizu cards are tier 1. This is Ishizu tier, this is Ishizu Naturia, blah blah. The reason why I put them separately is just to denote that they're still very, very strong cards and they're still heavily affecting the format. So regardless of where you decide to play the Ishizu cards, they are going to be amazing. But yeah, there's nothing else really to say about that. Kashtira is going to be the second most powerful deck of this format. Look, it's basically an FTK going first. Like, again, it's been a long time since we've had such a, I'd say, defining tier 1. The last tier 1 deck that was this defining, in my opinion, was probably Thunder Dragons, because we have tier 1 decks that are really strong that you have to play around, but like Tear Elements, for example. But Tear Elements by itself, at least, doesn't really stop you from playing the game. Ishizu tier does a little bit, but you don't have to do too much about Ishizu tier. It's just that it's way stronger than you. Kashtira, the ability to face down banish your extra deck and your main deck mean that you have to fundamentally change how your deck is built, because if you don't, you can auto lose to this deck on turn 1 before you even can put a card on the board, and I think that's really, really crazily powerful. Not only that, but the deck is very consistent. One Unicorn does a lot. Prime Pariso searches out Unicorn. Fenrir searches out Unicorn. They have so many ways to their cards. They have the level 4 monster as well. They have Papyrus, which summons from the deck. They have so many ways to start and continue their combat. And so this makes Kashtira super, super, super consistent, super powerful. And also they can break boards as well. They can play board breakers and break boards. They banish cards. They don't care about banishing. I mean, in fact, the other thing as well is in Kashtira mirror matches, they don't have to worry as much about face down banished because they have ways to retrieve face down banished cards. So Kashtira is just really, really, really good. Definitely format warping, yeah. Like, I don't think it's tier 0, but I think these 2 decks, in fact, you know what, I'm actually going to do it because I think it needs to be shown that these 3 kind of sets of cards are so far ahead of everything else, it's not even close. Like, the power level is just heavy. Like, these decks are going to do great, but these decks are the best. If you've got two equal players playing Kashtira and playing Sprite, for example, the Kashtira player has the advantage, in my opinion, most of the time. Rescue Ace is trash. Yep, we've seen some people play little engines and stuff elsewhere, but it's mostly trash. PHHY is an interesting deck, and I'll put it right at the bottom of Rogue. However, it does need the rest of its support. I would say it's just a new version of Sky Striker, a new version of Zodiac, which is quite cool. Mekanko, look, if it wasn't for the fact that Kashtira was in the format, I think Mekanko would have a chance of being a low tier 2 deck. It does do some very, very interesting and cool things. It's a very strong ritual equip archetype. However, it plays too many one-offs, and so it loses hard to Kashtira. It doesn't necessarily make an FTK board going first as well. The Libromancer Mekanko deck does do some very nice things with only 1 or 2 cards going first, but it's not enough in my opinion. It can be outed, and so because of that, yeah, it's going to be low Rogue. Plunder Patrol is one to watch. I think Plunder Patrol has a lot of advantages. It's a monotype deck, which means it's a monotype and kind of mono attribute deck. The extra deck is a little bit, but the fact that it's monotype and mono attribute means that it can play a lot of Floodgates, which is great. It can play Desires, so as in it doesn't auto lose the Kashtira shenanigans, especially as because of its Xenolock, it has duplicates of the cards of the extra deck, so much redundancy. Can play Hand Traps, can play Brave. Plunder Patrol definitely one to watch out, and Jord is a great card. Jord is also really good and means that the Kashtira matchup for Plunder is great because it summons a token to your opponent's board, which shuts off your opponent's Kashtira summons, which is also very, very good. So yeah, Plunder Patrol, definitely one to watch. Really, really good deck next format. I would say it's likely to be kind of mid to low tier 2 next format, but we'll see what happens. I don't think Crystal Beast is going to be as good next format. I think the power level is getting too high. I do think Conclave Control has a lot of potential. Recently, I was on a podcast with Neshi, and he really showed me some of the awesomeness of this deck. But unfortunately, I still think it's a bit lower. The power level of the format has crept up because now we've got another very strong going first deck. But yeah, we'll still see what happens. I'd say it's going to be mid to low Rogue. Telements, Kashtira, the combo of the two deck is really going to be what we need to see. And I'm going to put that in one to watch as well. So we already know Telements and Kashtira are both the best decks, but Telement Kashtira as a combo deck is just, it's so good. I think my first experience of this deck was the guy milled, I don't know how many cards, like, he basically milled all of my decks apart from like 7 cards. It was crazy, and then he had like a full board, and he had his Shizu cards in it as well. It was absolutely nutty, and the fact that he could do that, I didn't know how the heck to deal with it. So yeah, definitely one to watch. I think it's going to be a great, great, great deck. We'll see if we do see kind of more of Telements, Kashtira, or a combo of the two. It's interesting, and we'll see what happens. But yeah, definitely going to be a very powerful deck. Dark World, unfortunately, is low Rogue to no meta. Very, very good going first. However, it just loses too hard to too much things in the format. It loses to Dweller. It loses to everything that Tier loses to, which is already a problem. And then it also loses to everything that Kashtira is doing as well, which is a problem. And so even though it's very good going first, even though it could be very good going second, it's not the right format for it at the moment. And then lastly, Gishki. Gishki is going to be another one to watch, but I'm going to say it's going to be mid to low tier 2. And then when you combine it with Sprite is where we see the kind of high tier 2 coming out. Definitely lots of really, really good support for Gishki. And just, it's always been a good archetype. It's just needed a little bit of modernization, to be honest. So, yeah. So, guys, this is the tier list. And look, one of the things I would say is while it's a bit bleak, because obviously it's the same kind of decks at the top, and also you can't play a lot of Rogue if you want to do well in this format. What I do think is kind of hopeful for the future is that there's a lot of decks that have received very, very powerful support. And so if in the next ban list, Konami decides to hit these top decks hard, like if they hit, for example, the top 6 decks here, if all of these decks get significant hit, we would have a completely fresh form of a lot of new decks to play. Now, I don't trust Konami to do that, but I mean, it's something to be hopeful about. So, guys, thank you for all watching this. Yeah, definitely going to be good to see what happens. If you want to see amazing, amazing podcast content, make sure to look at the top or the bottom. I don't know. I'm going to put it somewhere on this page and go over to the Yu-Gi-Oh! Show and watch our latest episode with JY. But yeah, I'll talk to you all soon. Peace.